नमस्कार, मैं हूँ राजश्री आपके साथ और आज इंडिया लीगल में आपका स्वागत कर रही हूँ एक बार फिर से। और इस कार्यक्रम में इस विशेष कार्यक्रम में आज मेरे साथ एक ऐसा मेहमान जुड़ रहा है जो 7 समंदर पार से आया है, दूसरे महादेश से आया है। जी हाँ, हमारे साथ हमारे बेहद ख़ास मेहमान इस ILRF के मंच पर हैं इस वक्त प्रख्यात अमेरिकी वकील और अटॉर्नी एंड काउंसिलर एट लॉ मिस्टर बार्ट फिशर। वेरी वेलकम सर। और बार्ट फिशर साहब किसी परिचय के मोहताज नहीं है, लेकिन फिर भी मैं आप सबों के लिए ज़रूर बताना चाहूँगी कि ये वो नाम है जो IPR के लिए जाना जाता है। ये वो नाम है जिसने न जाने कितने देशों के लिए लड़ाई लड़ी है और उनकी कानूनी लड़ाई में इन्होंने मदद किया है। और इसलिए बहुत प्राउडली ये कहते हैं, बहुत गर्व से कहते हैं कि मैं एक कंट्री मैन हूँ जो कि कंट्रीज़ के लिए केसेस लड़ता हूँ। इसके साथ साथ बार्ट फिशर साहब लॉबिंग के लिए भी जाने जाते हैं। हालांकि भारत में लॉबी करना अलाउ नहीं है, लेकिन अमेरिका में ये बहुत मशहूर लॉबिस्ट भी हैं और ख़ासकर लेबर एंड ट्रेड मसलों के जानकार हैं, अंतर्राष्ट्रीय कानून के जानकार हैं। तो आज बार्ट फिशर से हम उनकी बात सुनेंगे और उनका ये जो ख़ास एक और मुहिम है उसके बारे में भी जानेंगे। बार्ट फिशर साहब इस वक्त पानी के लिए और बोन मैरो के लिए, यानी कि ज़िंदगी को बचाने के लिए कैसे बोन मैरो की ज़रूरत है, उस पर उनका फाउंडेशन काम कर रहा है, जो ये साफ करता है कि ये एक ऐसा वकील है जो केवल कानूनी लड़ाई ही लड़ना नहीं जानता, बल्कि आम जीवन को कैसे सुधारा जा सकता है, आम लोगों की कैसे मदद की जा सकती है, उसके लिए भी अपने हाथ बढ़ाता है। तो बार्ट फिशर साहब का बहुत बहुत स्वागत है। और आगे बढ़ने से पहले मैं ज़रूर आग्रह करना चाहूँगी सीनियर एडवोकेट प्रदीप राय जी से, जो कि ILRF के चेयरमैन भी हैं। बार्ट फिशर साहब का स्वागत करें।
He has been here for the first time and he is one of the most honorable guests of our office. So, sir, we really welcome you and we appreciate your visiting here and taking out time for the young lawyers and lawyer students. I really appreciate, sir, your time and we value your time. This is preamble of Indian Constitution. And one honor which we generally offer anyone from the Supreme Court Bar Association, gem of the bar. So this honor is especially for you, sir, from our bar.
Well, thank you. What a pleasure it is to be here and to be with the world's largest democracy from the world's oldest democracy. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I would like to explain to you why I came to India on this trip and what I'm doing here and what the future holds for my projects. I'm with Sanjana Jan and her H2O movement, which is focused on improving water in India, both the quantity, because you have a problem with scarcity, the quality, because 90% of the water consumed in India is not treated, and sustainability, that you can actually find the water and do it in a sustainable way. And it's been a voyage of discovery here for me to see the dimensions of the problem are amazing. And we're going from a period, who knows, maybe from trade wars to investment wars to space wars to water wars. And in fact, I used to represent Sudan for 7 years. And I can tell you there's an enormous water problem between Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt. Who's going to get the water from the River Nile? So all around the world, in fact, there are conflicts over water. So it's a very basic thing. Without water, there is no life. So you need water. I'm here on a second and significant mission, which deals with establishing a bone marrow transplant registry for India. And I realize that's a less newsworthy item than the water issue, but at the same time, you have to realize that two foundations of life, one is water, but another is stem cells. Without stem cells, you don't have blood. You don't have red cells, white cells, platelets. And without blood, you're not going to live anyway. So both the water issue and the stem cell issue deal with foundations of human life. And they're basic, actually. But here's the problem. On the issue I work on, mostly, on stem cells, India does not have a viable registry. And with the stem cells, the situation is you have a category of illnesses known as blood cancers. You have leukemia, aplastic anemia, lymphomas, and in India particularly, thalassemia, which we really don't have in the US. You have a variety of blood cancers that, to survive, you need new marrow. You need a bone marrow transplant. Without that, you won't be around. So in America, 41 years ago, I set up the bone marrow transplant registry in the United States. It's called the National Organ Transplant Act, and I'm in Washington, D.C. I am that worst species of lawyer, a lobbyist. Lobbyist in Washington is sort of, dodgy. And a lot of interesting questions about lobbying in Delhi that I've been asking, how the system works here. I'm sure you're the master of that and can educate me on if you have to register as a lobbyist, if you have to register as a foreign agent, a whole variety of things that I have to do in Washington, D.C. to lobby. And actually, in some countries, lobbying is unlawful. The assumption is that you're doing something bad by lobbying people. But in any event, I'm in Washington, D.C. That's my little sandbox. And I help people. We can pass a law. We can kill a law. It's a lot easier to kill a law than to pass a law. But in D.C., I worked on this issue of setting up what is known as the National Marrow Donor Program, otherwise known as Be the Match. So you're always looking for a match so you can give the bone marrow transplant. So marrow is very complicated. It's not like blood, which has 4 types, A, B, A, O. There are thousands of types of marrow. Marrow, and you discover that by looking at the protein markers on the cells, which are called antigens. And so you have to do a match, an antigen match on the cells. So the beauty of the situation now is that it's very easy to get in the registry. You just swab. So we call our campaign Swab for Life. And the idea is to get 80 million HLA marrow type donors in a registry in India so you can do bone marrow transplants. India has some, but it's a very tiny amount, less than 6 million at this point, are HLA marrow type in India. You need a registry of 80 million to have it really work. The reason is India has such a diverse population ethnically, and you're always looking for a needle in a haystack. So you are looking, you need a very large registry for it to be effective and work. We have 37 million HLA marrow type donors. These are voluntary people who've come and in the registry now. Half of them are from the United States. Half are international. So we have half our business is international. And we have marrows going all over the world with couriers once we find the match. So the person who is the match doesn't have to go, but just the marrow. You take it out from the peripheral blood, the stem cells. So, so far, we've done over 100,000 matches off the registry. These are people who wouldn't be around anymore if we didn't find the match. India, with 5 times our population, we can save 500,000 lives a year in this country if we get the registry going. And that's not insignificant. And it addresses international relations, too. I know you're interested in the bilateral relationship. There are 5 million Indians in the diaspora in the United States. Incidentally, a very successful diaspora, which has done very well. But those Indians could also benefit from a registry in India. So what we will eventually have is marrows going both ways, from the U.S. to India and India to the United States. Right now, India depends on the United States for its marrows. And my thought is India should have its own registry and be independent, have a freestanding registry. And to do that, we will launch this campaign called Swab for Life. Now, the technology has changed. It's in the 41 years since I started this. Before, you used to have to take a drop of blood, and now, to get marrow type. Now it's just swab. And before, if you found the match, you had to draw the marrow out of the hip bone. Now, you can take the stem cells out of the peripheral blood. So it's very easy to save a life. And once you are told you're a match, I mean, you can't stop people from doing it. It's very exciting. It's the one chance in your life you'll probably have to save a life. So we even have second donations. People who donate twice do this. So the registry is something that is saving lives every day. And it's my vision is to have the bone marrow registry global and all over the world. And I'm sort of like the Johnny Appleseed for registries. Everywhere I go, I try to set up a registry. And I've been to China, I've been to Cuba, where we don't have very good relations. And I met the Ministry of Health in Cuba, and I said, look, we're all mothers and fathers. If it's our kid, if you're a kid, you'd want to find a match. So we did the first medical agreement with Cuba, just as an example. So what this does for the bilateral relationships with our country, friends around the world, is very significant. It makes us literally blood brothers and sisters. I think it's terrific. So I think it's really cool if we can set up a registry here, save 500,000 lives a year, and it's a lot of work. And working with Sanjana, we've joined forces to go after these twin foundations of human life. And her Walk for Water, Walk for Life, we've joined with them, and we do Swab for Life and March for Marrow. So we're hoping to continue this next year, in fact, at Kumbe. Did I pronounce that the right way? And we'll have a big audience for all this. I always want to say kumbaya, my kumbaya moment at the Kumbe. But we can save a lot of lives if we get this registry going, and it's very easy to do, very easy to do. So the reason I came, this trip, we've had a very successful trip. We've met with many doctors, hospitals, potential funders to get the thing going here. And the issue is the same issue on marrow as it is on water, which is awareness. There's really not an awareness about the bone marrow transplant registry. Even in hospitals we've been to, doctors don't even, some of them don't seem to even know what I'm talking about. And on water, awareness is very key. That's why we have been doing these Walk for Water, Walk for Life movements. So we'll be back, as Arnold Schwarzenegger said in The Terminator, we'll be back probably end of January, early February to pursue this further. And now I know the other subject you're all interested in is what's happening in America with our elections, because that's going to determine the course of events between the two countries, in my opinion. And we still remain the essential superpower. In my opinion, the relationship that India and the United States have should be the most important relationship for each party. Our relationship with India should be our most important bilateral relationship, and vice versa. So we're hopeful, and right now it's very close. Just answer the question ahead of time, because that's what everybody asked me. The last two polls were 47-47 and 48-48. So it's a tie, essentially, within the margin of error. The election in the United States will be decided, is going to be very close, obviously. That's sort of BGO, blinding glimpse of the obvious. It's going to be very close. And it'll be decided on 3 swing states, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. And whoever wins Pennsylvania, in my opinion, will win the election. So that's why they're all campaigning. Both campaigns are in Pennsylvania, basically. They know that's going to be very, very close. But it's entirely possible also that the election will be a tie. There is a provision then that it goes to the House of Representatives for resolution. The House of Representatives is controlled by Republicans. So if it's a tie, the Republicans are going to get it. If it's very close, another possibility is that Trump loses in the popular vote but wins in the Electoral College. The Electoral College is skewed towards small states and Republican states, red states versus blue states. So it's entirely possible that we can have an election where Trump loses the popular vote but wins in the Electoral College. that would not be a good outcome because that would promote discontent, litigation, and as our lawyer friend here knows, this ends up in the courts. And in the year 2000, we had a situation where it was Bush v. Gore. It ended up in the courts on a very partisan 5-4 vote. Sandra Day O'Connor, the Republican, casting the key vote, the election went to Bush. So George W. Bush. So we don't want this to end up in the courts. That's not a healthy outcome. Where we are is we got about maybe 24 more days to the election. We have a very close election. And by the way, whoever wins, I think Modi had a bromance with Trump. Modi had a bromance now with Biden. When he came to Washington, he was treated like a rock star. It got a very, very, very positive welcome in the United States because it's a bipartisan thing. Both parties know we need India. We need India as a friend. We need India as a bulwark against China. The greatest foreign minister that the British ever had once said that nations do not have permanent friends or permanent interests or permanent enemies. They have permanent interests. And it's in our interest, the United States, to work with India, and it's in India's interest to work with the United States. So we have a relationship that's based on logic on both sides, should work well for both sides, regardless of who wins the election. But the problem with Trump is his agenda has been America first and tending towards isolationism, and Biden has been more pro-alliances. And so I like the alliance route better. When you need them, you have friends, and that's the importance of alliances. So, but we're working very positively with India on the Quad in terms of security, and I see more defense cooperation, in fact, joint military exercises. The problem from the standpoint of the United States is that no matter how hard we try to leave the Middle East, we get sucked back in. Now you have the conflict in Gaza, and that's a nightmare of the Middle East situation. You have a conflict in Ukraine, that's another nightmare, and the U.S. is getting sucked back in, where we're giving enough weapons for the Ukraine not to lose, but not enough to win. So it's a dilemma the president has. So the real action, though, is here in Asia. It's not there. From the U.S. standpoint, the agenda is this has got to be the Asian century, and this is Modi's moment, because what's happening now is the problem is China. China has not acted as a responsible stakeholder in the international system. We saw that with the COVID, with the way it started, the way it was spread, and the lack of transparency in China to this day about how it started. And so in the South China Sea, you have a really bad situation with friction with Philippines, Vietnam, and other countries where China wants to make it a lake, the China Lake. And so despite the rulings of the International Court, China said, no, we have the 9-stroke line and we own all this. So basically, there's going to be a lot of friction and concern in my mind between now and the year 2049. Why do I say 2049? 2049 is the centenary of the Communist China Revolution. Mao declared the People's Republic of China in Tiananmen Square 100 years ago on 1949. And Xi Jinping has said that by that date, China will be the dominant power. So you have a situation where they're going to go after Taiwan, maybe, by 2049. They hope Taiwan falls into their lap like a ripe apple. And if it doesn't, they've made indications they would take it by force. And that would not be good. So the U.S. has a mutual defense treaty with Taiwan, actually. And we have a mutual defense treaty with Philippines. So the U.S. is has to be very concerned about what happens here and in the South China Sea and with China. Obviously, India has to be concerned about its border with China. There are a lot of bilateral issues between those two countries. So looking ahead, I see this is the most dangerous period in international relations since World War II, in my opinion. It's a very dangerous situation.
Since you have represented China in the trade wars, the question is, the Biden administration increased non-tariff barriers on Chinese electric vehicles. So how do you see that pan out?
You know, when Trump was president, we had trade wars. We had the U.S. average tariff rose from 2% to 20% on China imports. Trump has said in the campaign so far, who knows what he'll say going forward, but so far he's said if he's elected, there will be a 10 to 20% tariff on all goods, on all countries. Now, that includes India. So immediately you would have tariffs. India would have tariffs, coming into the United States. He's also said that he would impose an immediate 60% tariff on China imports into the United States. He's also said he would impose a tariff of 200% on countries that are found to be underpricing, undervaluing its currency, or engaging in currency manipulation. Now, that was a practice that China did engage in, currency manipulation. And the reason is that China has control over its foreign exchange. It's an administrative agency called SAFE, State Agency for Foreign Exchange. And they regulate their foreign exchange through buying and selling in the foreign exchange market. So for a long period, China undervalued its currency, a very long period. From the year, I would say 1995 through 2015. That allowed the greatest peacetime transfer of wealth in human history because our manufacturing base got hollowed out. That manufacturing went to China, and China took away, we had a huge trade deficit with China because of the currency undervaluation. And there's a very interesting index called the Big Mac Index, which is what would a McDonald's Big Mac cost in each country. And under the Big Mac Index, it was like 70% undervalued. So the World Bank Index was like 50% undervalued. So that was a huge weapon China has used to engage in international trade dominance, is currency manipulation, currency undervaluation. And they've just taken away jobs in the U.S. on the manufacturing side. I'm originally from St. Louis, Missouri, which is in the middle. We're real heartland people. And it's hollowed out. St. Louis is hollowed out. We used to have a big automobile industry making cars in St. Louis. That's gone. And it goes on. We had airplane manufacturing and beer manufacturing, and it was on. Those businesses are gone. And China has taken over a lot of those segments of industry through trade policy. So it's a very good question. Now, the interesting thing is Biden, as a Democrat, came after Trump and the trade wars, and he didn't roll it back. Why didn't he roll it back? He didn't increase it, but he didn't stop it. So he kept the higher tariffs on China. And the reason is, one word, labor. The labor unions support the Democratic Party. And the labor unions like the tariffs. They like the Trump tariffs. So they got to see more jobs kept their way. So at the end of the day, it's a bipartisan issue now of at least protection for the U.S. businesses and manufacturing and industry. I'm a free trader, so I don't like that. I like free trade, I like open markets, I like free commerce. But the political reality is that Donald Trump has taken the Republican Party, which used to be the party of free trade, to a party of protectionism. And that is the policy he promises to bring back if he's reelected. So I don't like that at all. But on the other hand, if the Democrats get reelected, they're not rolling back and going to lower tariffs either. So the one issue that both parties agree on in our country is they don't like China. They're mad at China, and they see the huge transfer of wealth which has gone to China, and they're not happy about it. And it's jobs, jobs, jobs. That's what politicians want in their district. So this is a very political winner for both parties to say, well, we're mad at China. But actually, we're mad at China for a good reason on trade. I mean, they have used subsidies, the central government. And this is what I call the Beijing consensus, which is that government intervention is a good thing, and versus the Washington consensus, which was we believed in free trade and open markets. That was the Bretton Woods consensus after 1947. Maybe in the middle, there's something we could learn from India and have what I call the Mumbai consensus, where we need the state intervention, but we like free markets. So there's a balance. Maybe we can look for India in guidance, actually. And so while I'm on that, I think Modi's done a terrific job. He has a difficult job to govern this country It's amazing with 300 living languages in many states and cultures, and it's just an impossible job at best. So overall, regardless of who wins our election, I think we'll stay close with India, stay close with Modi, and but we need to do, in my opinion, what we did with Europe after World War II. After World War II, the great menace for Western Europe was communist Soviet Union. So we did the Marshall Plan in 1947. We gave a lot of aid and assistance to Western Europe to be a bulwark against communism coming from Russia at that point. Well, the Marshall Plan was very successful. Europe became very prosperous and was good for us. Now we have a similar situation. We need to support India. We need to have a plan for India, again, as a bulwark against China. This is communist China this time. So people say, history, if you don't learn from the past, Santayana said, you're doomed to repeat it. I don't think that's true exactly. I think history rhymes. It doesn't necessarily repeat. But the rhyme here is the whole situation on Taiwan and the information technology revolution and the fact that right now 80% of the world's semiconductors are produced in Taiwan. And they're very advanced. That leads to artificial intelligence, which is the future. And one of the things I am doing in India is working on trying to set up more data centers, which are going to be needed, and a huge electricity requirement to run these things, because they take 10 times the electricity of an average Google search. So at the end of the day, this Taiwan thing is a flashpoint that I believe is the most dangerous situation in the world. And China it's a predator on the prowl. And so we have to be very strong in our alliances and work together on military exercises, common defense, bilateral relations, trade. For example, in the very old days, you used to have what they call the colonial preference. Then you had GSP, Generalized System of Preferences, where the U.S. gave duty-free treatment to India goods. Then that went away. And what I would like is to see a duty-free treatment for goods from India, and I would call it the American preference. Now, we want to work with India. We think that would be a good thing. We also need investment preferences. I would have all income earned by, you'll love this, all income earned by corporations in India should be tax-free and deferred. And we used to have that policy with Puerto Rico with the pharmaceutical companies. It's called Section 936 of the Internal Revenue Code. And the big pharma companies went to Puerto Rico because they got tax-free treatment. So my thinking is on the investment side, we need a new bilateral investment treaty with India that addresses digital, the world of digital commerce, internet, and many different new issues. So we need to work bilaterally on the trade side. We need to work bilaterally on the investment side. And we need to work on technology because that's the future. And we need to work on space cooperation. We were at Hindustan Institute of Technology and Sciences. It's unbelievable what they're doing at that university on space. They're working with ISRO on satellites and telecommunications in space. And that's very important because whoever controls space controls Earth. And that's the big competition going on now. And so we need to work very closely, I think, with ISRO here, in space programs. And then I'm on the different issue of health security. I think we saw in the pandemic that we were all unprepared for what happened at the end of the day. And we should have learned from that. And now going forward, we need to work together on health-related issues like the bone marrow transplant registry to bring it back full circle. That's what I'm working on. So we have a great agenda going forward, but trade, you asked the right question. That is a huge friction point with the U.S. and with the rest of the world. It's not just the U.S. If they subsidize, it affects you as well as the U.S., right? So it's a very big concern. But this points out the legal problem that the current regulations for world trade, it's an organization called the World Trade Organization, the WTO, based in Geneva. It's a successor to the GATT. Well, it's very ineffective at this point. And the reason it's ineffective is its dispute resolution process takes far too long. And by that time, as the sage said once, in the long run, we're all dead. So you wait 3 years for a resolution of a trade crisis, it's pointless. So we need a new trade organization that addresses the real problems of trade going forward, including telecom, digital, internet, e-commerce. You're in a different world now from 47 when you had the Bretton Woods institutions established. So also we need to work with India more at the United Nations. I noticed that the UNDP has 4,000 workers here. I mean, there are a lot of areas we can cooperate with India on. Anyway, thanks for the question. And that's what I do. I do trade cases in Washington. It's an agency. We have an alphabet soup of agencies in Washington, 20 agencies that deal with trade. Export-Import Bank, OPIC, DFC. I plead at the U.S. International Trade Commission. So my legal cases are there. They're like dumping cases if you think somebody has been dumping, or countervailing duty if you think someone has been subsidizing, or intellectual property rights, dealing with patents, copyrights, trademarks. Those cases are all at the ITC, the International Trade Commission, and that's really where my practice is for my day job. And that's a very interesting legal practice because only lawyers are allowed to cross-question, which means if the expert witness is an economist, you have to know enough about the microeconomics of each industry in order to cross-examine the opposing economist, not lawyer, economist. So I have a PhD in international trade, so my background, I'm well trained to do what I do, and I've always enjoyed doing it, and I've been doing it for a long time, and I still like doing it, and I'm still getting cases. The other thing I do is I represent countries. I tell people I'm just a country lawyer, I represent countries. I've represented 9 countries since the year 2000 in Washington, D.C., including actually China, Israel, Dominican Republic, Suriname, Guyana, Panama, and that's a Washington, D.C. practice. It's really unique because the embassies are there. We have 150 embassies that you start dealing with the ambassador, and then you work your way back to find out the problems of the country, and then you end up getting hired or you don't. But I enjoyed that practice. And my last recent big was Sudan. I represented Sudan for 7 years, and now it's still a mess, but that's not my fault.
तो ये सवाल जवाब का दौर जारी रहेगा, लेकिन एक ब्रेक लेते हैं और ब्रेक के बाद एक बार फिर से ये दौर शुरू होगा. बहुत सारे सवाल हमने लिए हैं, अभी बहुत कुछ जानना बाकी भी है आपसे मिस्टर फिशर. सो लेट्स टेक अ ब्रेक. तो एक बार फिर से स्वागत है ILRF के इस मंच पर. जैसा कि मैंने आपको बताया कि फिशर साहब अंतर्राष्ट्रीय स्तर के बोन मैरो ट्रांसप्लांट के जनसाधारण को मुहैया कराने के लिए भी काम कर रहे हैं, और इसके अलावा कानूनी लड़ाई में कई देशों की वो मदद कर चुके हैं और अभी भी कर रहे हैं. अमेरिका के सबसे जो बड़े वकील हैं उनमें से उनका एक नाम है. आजकल अमेरिका में बहुत कुछ हो रहा है और अमेरिका बहुत कुछ बहुत जगह पे कर रहा है. इन सभी बातों पर विस्तार से चर्चा करेंगे. भारत की कानून व्यवस्था को वो कैसे देखते हैं ये जानने की कोशिश करेंगे. अंतर्राष्ट्रीय मसलों पर जो कानूनी दावपेच होती हैं उसको कैसे सुलझाया जाए, इन सभी चीज़ों पर विस्तार से चर्चा करेंगे. लेकिन सबसे पहले बार्ट फिशर साहब को सुनते हैं.
Sir, in your experience, how has the global trade system has adopted in the time of crisis such as pandemic or economic downfall?
Okay, that's another great question. Look, it turned out that the pandemic was a disaster for a lot of leaders around the world. Trump, for example, was doing very well his first 3 years, and he would have won, in my view, but for the pandemic. The pandemic happened, he totally bungled it, he mishandled it, he made fun of people who wore masks, who tried to protect themselves, and he purposely would never wear a mask, and he just sent the wrong signal. So Bolsonaro in Brazil also paid the price. They're leaders around the world, so it was a very tough period for all leaders, really. And for Modi, by the way, sent villagers walking 200 miles barefoot back to their villages. I mean, you know, it's a very difficult set of decisions the leaders had to make around the world. But that's the reason Trump didn't win the re-election, in my view. And Biden, by the way, I think did a great job coming in. Very difficult situation with so much unemployment. And you're asking about the impact is huge in the U.S. The real salient issue now in the U.S., though, and this is a result of the pandemic, and it's true around the world, is inflation. Inflation, you go now, a pizza I used to buy at Safeway for $3.50 is now $7. So inflation is on the minds of the American voters. That's what we call the pocketbook issue. And the pocketbook issues are huge in the U.S. for the governing party, which is now the Democrats. But around the world, you have more inflation, as a result of the pandemic. And it's called the law of supply and demand. So at the end of the day, we're pulling out of it. I think India has turned the corner, thankfully, but it wasn't easy. And the same thing in the U.S. The U.S. now has inflation down to about 2.5% annually. The Federal Reserve target is 2%. So that's not too bad. So we've done better on inflation, but for years it was like 9%. That's not good. And the House, we call it the pocketbook issues. Democrats paid a big price for that, but Trump paid the ultimate price. I mean, that cost him the election. And so going forward, though, the U.S. turned the corner. We have very good jobs reports, which are helping Kamala Harris in the re-election. These are very timely economic good news for the U.S. Is unemployment claims are down. And more people now have jobs in America than ever before, and that's a good thing. And inflation is down. It should be at 2%, but it's like 2.5. So it's going in the right direction. And but no question, the pandemic took a toll. It took a big toll on economies around the world. I mean, what can you say? And there'll be more. This is not going to be the last pandemic. You'll have health crises. We just have to be prepared. The lesson we learned was we didn't have masks. We didn't have oxygen tanks. We didn't have respirators. All those things to take care of COVID, we didn't have. And we had to, literally, Ford Motor Company had to convert its automobile factory to make respirators. I mean, it was crazy. So I hope we learn from that. I hope India learns from it. I hope the U.S. has tried to learn from it. So, pandemic was a disaster, no doubt about it. But I think India's turned the corner, U.S. has turned the corner. But no doubt there'll be another one. And then the question is, have we learned the lessons, as I said before, from the past about history? It does, at least rhymes. And the pandemic was a disaster. And I was home. I mean, no one in Washington, D.C., it's like 50% occupied, the buildings still. People work remotely. They work from home. It changed our whole life pattern. All of a sudden, I go into the office maybe once a week for appointments. I don't know what you do, but I have to go in for appointments once or twice a week. Otherwise, I work at home. And by the way, I'm all zoomed out. You have all these Zoom conferences. I mean, I'd rather meet people, have the interpersonal relationship, and get to know people that you can only learn through body language and being in the same room with somebody. And that's been missing, now we're all Zoom calls. I don't like that. So pandemic had a huge effect on our lives, the way we live our lives. But I'm optimistic. I think, hopefully we've learned and we'll be ready for the next. Well, one of the interesting things Sanjana pointed out to me as we were driving around, seeing all these animals. These cows look skinny. The cows look like they need food. There's not water or food. And so what's happened is the encroachment of industry on our forests and our natural preserves have forced us into closer contact with animals. And this COVID probably came from a market in China. So the closer we get to animals, because the environment is being despoiled, the more of these kind of episodes we're going to have. I mean, there's a vicious circle here.
As recently there has been increased tension between India and Canada, so how is that going to impact relation between USA and India, as USA has close ties with both the countries?
This is an issue that affects not only Canada, but the United States. Because if, in fact, there was a conspiracy or a plan to have leaders attacked in foreign countries, that raises all kind of international legal issues of extradition, evidence gathering, finding out the facts. The government of Canada has not been very good about disclosing its facts or its basis for doing what it did, and that raises other questions. The government of Canada alleges that the government of India has not been very open about its intelligence practices, and I understand that too. So we have a situation that's in the U.S. is the same issue of if whether leaders in India that Modi doesn't like are being targeted. I mean, that's not good either. So it's not a good situation. And I think we just have to have more cooperation on both sides. It definitely has adversely affected the relationship with Canada. I mean, as Sanjana was pointing out, the embassy there is pretty empty right now. And so as far as the U.S. is concerned, it's a matter of concern. But we just need to find out more facts and be guided by the facts and the evidence. Take it where it leads. But to find out the evidence, you have to be open about your sources of intelligence. And countries are very sensitive about that. So this issue is not going to be resolved tomorrow, I can tell you, because both countries are sensitive about disclosing their sources and uses of intelligence. So to say, as the lawyers would say, the jury is out on that one.
Pharmaceutical industry is also involved in bone marrow transplantation in some form. Now what we find is that there is a conflict, a standoff between United States and India on IPR related to pharmaceutical products. Now India has been always emphasizing affordable medicines, whereas United States has been sticking to more strict enforcement of IPR regime. In fact, recently India has been put into the priority watch list of Special 301 for alleged malpractice enforcing IPR protections. So do you think there is a middle ground in which India and US can meet and resolve this IPR issue, especially in pharmaceutical industry?
Well, let's talk about this, a very interesting issue. In the United States, our system of intellectual property rights is just fundamental. Why? We want to give incentives to brilliant scientists or to little 12th graders to invent things, invent new things. If you invent a new thing in America, under our patent law, we give you a monopoly, a 21-year monopoly. You get a patent, no one else can use it. So the idea, the pharma companies, I know what you're getting at. The pharma companies in the United States, let's take Bristol Myers with Ozempic, which is the new anti-obesity thing. That's the hot thing now. And in Hollywood, you have the Ozempic face, where the stars have lost all this weight using. Okay, well, Bristol Myers spent billions of dollars to develop that. Research and development, and their argument is, look, we spent all this money on R&D to develop new drugs. We are entitled to a patent, and we own it. Now, on Mount Rushmore, you have Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson is one of the founders, and he invented the patent system. It was his idea. And why? Again, it encourages technology, innovation, invention, all the things you want. But it costs money. The pharma companies spend a lot of money. I talked last night with the Danish ambassador about their company, Novo Nordisk. That's a wonderful pharma company, and they spent a lot of money to develop insulin drugs to take care of diabetes. Well, they got a patent on it, and guess what? They're entitled to it, in my opinion. The problem is the conflict between our IPR laws and the needs of developing countries and emerging markets. Poor countries say, hey, we can't afford these high pharma prices, and our people are sick. So obviously this is a huge issue for India, which is the largest producer of generic drugs in the world. Why? Generic is cheaper. Generic undercuts our patents, and so there's a natural tension. You're pointing out the tension, and how do you resolve it? So the answer is you have what we call licensing. And if you have the patent in the US, you license it, but you cut a deal, the terms and conditions of each license. So the big pharma companies in the U.S. have to cut good deals, favorable deals, and in return for that, they get access to the Indian market. So there's a deal to be made here. Listen, life is a negotiation. This thing is a negotiation. And the pharma companies are entitled to their patents because they spend billions of dollars to develop these drugs. But at the same time, the U.S. government has to be cognizant of the difficulties of emerging markets. That's why we had the GSP system before, Generalized System of Preferences for developing countries. So we want to encourage economic development. We don't want sick people here to die. We want sick people to get better. So they need access. And that's why India has this great generic drug industry. I mean, you're very good. This is your Wockhardt. You have these great companies, and they do great work. So I think there has to be intellectual interchange between the two countries on IPR. But it's the answer is licensing. And once you have a patent, you license it at reasonable terms. And but this has been a huge issue around the world, not just India. It's Brazil, China, obviously. I have IPR issues in China. It's a constant in my practice. For example, in the world of chemistry, there's a very famous publication called the Chemical Abstracts. You're not a chemist if you don't have the chemical abstracts. Guess what? The government of China has the government printing press in Shanghai printing our chemical abstracts. It's the government of China that's doing it. So that's a massive issue. And I worked for years on that question. And I had met a guy named Duan Rushan, who's head of intellectual property rights in China, the government. And he said, well, Mr. Fisher, there are two problems with your case. I said, really? What's that? He said, well, number one, it's old. I said, oh, I get it. So there's a statute of limitations on theft. That went nowhere. He said, the second problem is it's very expensive. The subscription is $18,200 a year on chemical abstracts. I said, oh, I get it. If I'm outside a Mercedes showroom and I want that car, I have a right to take it because it's very expensive. So that argument didn't go anywhere. The point is they still do it, and the students from China bring it back to China who study in the U.S. There's no way we can keep the chemical abstracts from going back to China. And now on the internet, they knock it off on the internet. So IPR is a huge issue with China, much more than India, actually. And I've had other trade cases just on IPR. I had one on sanitary standards, and I've had IPR cases with South Korea, Samsung, Japan. This is an international problem, not just India. But India is so talented. The drug companies, or the generic drugs, are tremendous. But they're different standards, too. Your other question about the standards being different. You have to address that, too. That's a separate trade issue. That's called standards. And we have a standards code in the WTO which addresses that issue. And there is a committee that does look at those issues, again, as bilateral issues between countries. And you have to talk it out and try to make a deal where the standards work, for everybody in both cases. But I do a lot of work in the standards area. For example, every time I see a fire extinguisher, you'll love this, I think of a trade case I had. The U.S. had a rule. The U.S. had a rule saying no fire extinguisher could be sold in America unless it was tested during the course of manufacture in America, which kept out all the foreign fire extinguishers. So I represented foreign countries. So it took me years to get that rule changed. The standards are a huge issue in international trade. Pharma is just one area where it's a big issue, but it's pervasive. The other is the Coast Guard has rules that say life preservers on boats in America can only be those that are produced in America. I mean, give me a break. I mean, India could make life preservers. They can't be sold. So I had to work on that rule. So standards is a huge area in trade, and there's a different code. So you have tariff barriers. I talked about tariff barriers before, but you have non-tariff barriers. Standards are a non-tariff barrier to trade, and I work on that all the time. It's a great question.
Thank you so much, Mr. Bart. We are having you as a guest. My question is this, since you have talked about water, bone marrow, and the other rights, it's all about quality of human life. It's leading to quality of human life. And we are very much aware about this, that if you want to maintain a quality human life, you need to intact human rights. do you think that we are right now we are sensitive enough about human rights, especially when we are seeing whatever is happening in Middle East?
Great question, very important question. Human rights was actually brought to the fore in U.S. foreign policy by Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter was the first president who made human rights an essential aspect of U.S. foreign policy, and to make sure that human rights were being upheld around the world. And ever since then, since the Carter years, and he's had the Carter Center for, which has promoted human rights. I say frequently, Jimmy Carter is our greatest living ex-president. He's still living, by the way. He's 100 years old. God bless him. So, human rights. One person's freedom fighter is another person's terrorist. Okay, so you have different ways of looking at people around the world. Human rights can mean many things. It can mean civil rights. In America, we fought, and we still have not completed the civil rights revolution. African Americans are still at the back of the bus in the U.S. Indians are discriminated against in the U.S. Foreigners, in general, have a more difficult path to success. So it depends how you define human rights, but civil rights is where I start the discussion. And I'm from St. Louis. So as I grew up, all the blacks had to go to the back of the bus. I remember, I'll never forget that. And then in Alabama, there was a lady named Rosa Parks. She fought that. She said, I'm not going to the back of the bus. And that started the civil rights revolution in the South, which continues, by the way, not over. So civil rights, it's a huge issue even in the U.S. We're not there. This is still an imperfect union. And in India, you have the Dalits, you have untouchables, you have the class system, you have your own issues with human rights. And different countries, they have different human rights issues. What bothers me is now around the world, particularly in Europe and the U.S., you have immigration issues. And when you have these immigration issues, and you have Mexicans, Central Americans, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, Panama, Salvador, flooding the U.S., it causes great resentment. And when you have families separated at the border coming in, and that's what Trump did, he separated the families. And a lot of those kids still have not found their parents. I mean, so that's a violation of civil rights, but do they have a right? And that gets back to another legal issue of the total misuse of the asylum provision in U.S. immigration laws. All of a sudden, everyone has an asylum right? From what? You're hungry, you're worried about violence, you're worried about getting raped, you're worried about getting killed. The original intention was political asylum. It was not the way it's been used. So great resentment now against the immigrants who are coming in. And Trump is using that in the campaign very, very effectively, I might add. Yeah. And that may be the issue that carries him. That's his big issue is immigration. Yeah. But the result of this tremendous flood of immigrants, and he vowed he'd build a wall. That was his original campaign promise in 2017. He'd built some of it, but not all of it. It's a huge issue. And so those civil rights are being violated, but do they have a right at all? He had a stay in Mexico policy, which I thought made sense. Day one of the Biden administration, he got rid of the stay in Mexico policy. Then the immigrants start flooding in. And then now their civil rights are being violated. And so it's a tough issue. I represented Sudan for many years. In Darfur, you had tremendous violations of civil rights. You had people being in Darfur being killed. The Janjaweed militias go kill people in Darfur to this day. So that's a violation of civil rights and human rights. So it depends how you define the term. But as I say, one person's freedom fighter is another person's terrorist. It's a tough issue.
Yeah. So we need to be more sensitive about this issue. So, sir, as you started your speech that you are a countryman representing different country as a lawyer. My question is this: since you have seen so many legal system of the different countries, how you rate the Indian legal system,
because we are proud of this fact that we have an ideal constitution and we have a very strong legal system. But we want to know, according to you, how you rate the Indian legal system and what will be message for the budding lawyers or the practicing lawyers in the India?
Great question, obviously. I've told people for many years, China was the bet for the short term. India is the bet for the long term. Why? Rule of law, democracy. It's messy, but it's democracy. Everyone goes to vote. It's amazing. So I think India has a wonderful legal system. Great lawyers like our friend can go argue water rights and win. And I think that my message to the budding lawyers is keep doing what you're doing, and you should teach here comparative legal systems. That's a course that introduces you to different legal systems. And we talked about the abortion issue last night. I mean, cultures look at that issue of women's reproductive rights different ways. So even issues like a proposal for marriage we discussed last night is looked at in different ways in different cultures. So essentially what I am is a student of culture. I love to figure out, if I'm negotiating with the Japanese or against them, I want to know what's their hot button. You know, how can I reach them to get what I want? So it's a system that should encourage U.S. investors. You have rule of law. You can appeal your case. And so I think I'm very impressed with the legal system. And we want to come back, in fact, and meet the parliamentarians here and try to lobby and change laws and work with parliamentarians to do that in a way that's positive and constructive. So yeah, I'm a fan of compare it to China. Are you kidding? Where would you want to put your money? In China, the state council changed. I've had this happen to me repeatedly, where I'll have an investment, and the state council just passes a rule overnight. It's not good. Well, that's arbitrary and capricious, as we say in the law, and you don't have that here as much. But it's complicated. You have the different states and jurisdictions and central government issues. So it's complex, but it works, and it's messy, but it works here. I'm very bullish on the Indian legal system. I wish I knew more about it, but it's really. I think Modi has done a good job with the legal system. He's tried to bring people in. He said again this week he wants to have a more inclusive India, and that's a good thing.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Fisher, to be as our guest. And what is your last message to the India, to the, as I said, the lawyers, the journalists? What do you think that in coming days, where India and the U.S. relationship is heading?
Well, I'm a very optimistic person by nature. My favorite song is "We Shall Overcome." And the burdens that we face, the barriers that we face, they can be overcome. And as I say, life is a negotiation. You know, we just have to talk, we have to communicate, and we have to be more open with each other. You know, someone in space from Mars or the moon looking at the Earth, seeing all these people fighting, like why? We're all one human family at the end of the day. And that's the beauty of the bone marrow transplant idea, is that we're becoming blood brothers and blood sisters and being closer, taking advantage of the fact that we're all one human family. And so I'd like to see more peace, less war. My message is lawyers have a big role to play in all that, though, because this is disputes, and you play a role in dispute settlement, right? So that's really what you're training people to do. I think one of the blessings of the British legal system, some things they did weren't great, but some things they did were very good. They built some very pretty buildings here, I must say. The architecture is good, but the legal system is good too. So, yeah, my message to lawyers is, regardless, even if you don't practice, it's a great training for whatever you do in the business world or elsewhere, because it teaches you how to think. It's a way of thinking. It's a thought process. And at the end of the day, whether you're in business, law, medicine, research, it's a thought process. And you learn the facts, you apply the law, and you argue your case. You do that throughout life. So I think it's a great discipline. I was glad I went to law school. I went to law school after I had a PhD in international trade. So I did a joint degree, like a joint degree, PhD, JD. So my advice to young students is the world is becoming more specialized. There has to be a reason for someone to call you to do anything. So I'm a fan of what I call joint degrees, where you learn, like at Georgetown University, we have the JD MSFS, Master of Science in Foreign Service, and law degree. They're separate degrees, but it's a joint degree. So you get, because we've talked before about patents and technology. Become an engineer, go to Georgia Tech as an engineer, and then go to law school. Then you can argue patents and know what the hell you're talking about. That's a big deal. So it's specialization. So I'm a fan of specialization, and go for joint degrees. Don't just be satisfied with your law degree. Go on and study more.
तो हमारे साथ ये थे हमारे आज के ख़ास मेहमान बार्ट फिशर, बहुआयामी व्यक्तित्व के धनी, जिन्होंने साफ तौर पर कहा कि मुझे संस्कृतियों के बारे में जानने में विशेष आनंद आता है। जैसा कि उन्होंने बताया कि किस तरह से अंतर्राष्ट्रीय स्तर पर बहुत कुछ बदलने की ज़रूरत है और उम्मीद बनाए रखने की ज़रूरत है। हम सभी को इस बात की उम्मीद है कि आने वाले समय में हम सभी और कुछ करें न करें, विश्व शांति की ओर ज़रूर बढ़ेंगे। और मेरे ख़्याल से किसी भी देश के लिए या विश्व के लिए अगर हम कुछ भी अच्छा चाहते हैं तो हमारे पास एक बेहतरीन कानूनी व्यवस्था होनी चाहिए। और इसी उम्मीद में कि आने वाले समय में जो ये लड़ाइयाँ हैं, ख़ासकर कानूनी लड़ाइयाँ हैं, वो इसलिए नहीं लड़ी जाएंगी कि दो लोगों के बीच में भेद हो, बल्कि इसलिए लड़ी जाएंगी कि मानवता का कुछ तो भला हो। चलिए इसी उम्मीद में आज बस इतना ही इस खास कार्यक्रम में मुझे दीजिए इजाज़त। अगले हफ्ते फिर से आपके सामने होंगे एक ख़ास मेहमान के साथ। नमस्कार।